Safety budget. Do we have any bill introductions today? All right. Well, then we will move into our budget analysis from Shirley.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and Committee. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is no, this is not a budget hearing. Don't get confused. I know this looks very similar, but this was last year's budget. I'm not going to give you a budget analysis for this year yet. We're holding on to those till we get them all finished. But for those of you who may be new to the committee, I do want to show you what they look like and what information is in them so that when we do start budget hearings, you'll know and understand what's in all of these different tables and what some of the terminology means. So in essence, you start out with what we call a front table. This is just a very basic overview of the budget. It's broken into operating and capital improvements. There's a brief description of the agency below that, and then an executive summary of the current year. Now, that may include some language that we will talk about on reappropriations. And for those of you who may not know that term, that is money when fiscal year 2022 closed on June 30th, was state general fund that was not expended. If the agency has language in the appropriations bill that allows them to reappropriate, anything over $100 moves forward into the next year for them to expend. So we will talk here about if they have any reappropriations, which will move into 2023. We provide you with some nice bar charts for 23 and 24. Those are just summaries. In figure 4 on page 1403, this is a little more deeper dive of the budget. We put this into what we call categories of expenditures. So you will see under operations, salaries and wages, contractual services, commodities, capital outlay, and debt service interest. State aid to locals is pass-through money that goes to other taxing authorities, municipalities, other state agencies, those kind of things. And then other assistance is pass-through money that would go to people. I always use higher education as my example. State aid to locals would be in the Board of Regents, the money that goes to the community and technical colleges in Washburn, whereas other assistance is scholarships, goes to students. Then you have your capital improvements and debt service principal. We put debt service principal in capital improvements because that's usually where they built a building or did something in capital improvements, whereas the interest we put up in operations. Then again, we try to give you some colorful line graphs on how a few years, about 10 years of depending on whether it's state general fund or one of their fee funds, we'll give you some information on that. On the next page, we have a little bar chart on one of their operating funds, and we show you a few years of what the revenues, what the expenditures, and what the ending balance is in the fund. If they have a lot of fees, you'll notice on the next page, we may have a table of the fees. Many times you'll be interested in this, in that are the current fees at the same amount as the statutory limit? And what will happen there is if for whatever reason their expenditures are such that they need to raise fees, then we need to look at, do they need to raise them over the statutory limit? And when that happens, they have to introduce a bill. So we always provide that to you. What's the current limit of the funds and what's the statutory limit? On the next page, we have a breakdown of the current year. So for this year, it'll be 2023. We will show you where they started from last year's legislative action, and then what changes were made and what the governor's recommendation is. Now, again, this is a pretty simple budget, so there's not a lot to look at there, but we do break it down into what's the agency requesting in addition to what they got last year, and then what did the governor have in her recommendations. We also, because we get a lot of questions over what the the final actual expenditures in 22 were versus what they're asking for in 23. So on the next page, we do a little description of why do they need more money or why less money in the current year versus what they did last year. So we will explain those. Many times that will have to do with maybe you added money to their budget last year, which is why it's more than the actuals in the year before. The next page will be, and again, this is because this is last year. In this year's budget, it'll be 2024 for the budget year. Same thing. We will start with where they were in last year's budget, what additional items they're requesting for this year's expenditures or for the next year's expenditures, and then what were the governor's recommendations. And then the last part is we get into a little bit of the performance measures. And again, you've probably seen those. We published those a couple of weeks ago, all of the different performance measures for all the state agencies, but we give a little description of that here. And if we had an agency like transportation or corrections that had capital improvements, your very last page will be capital improvements. And we'll go through those as well. Any questions on the information that will be in the budget analysis?
Representative Resman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just wondering if you could possibly explain the difference between SGF and special revenue funds.
Okay, special revenue funds are anything other than state general funds. Now, there can be appropriated special revenue funds. We have state institutions building fund, children's initiative fund. Those are considered special revenue funds, and those are appropriated by the state, but they're not state general funds. We keep those separated. And then other state general funds, specifically like for this agency, are their fee funds. Those are considered special revenue funds.
Representative Delperdang.
Just to follow up, for example, like KHP, where they have a resource stream coming in there, is that more special funds versus?
Special revenue funds, it could be docket fees, it could be the fuel tax, transportation, anything like that. It would not be federal funds, those are categorized differently, but it would be anything that the state collects that's not state general fund tax revenue.
And then a general question to the speaker, or chairman, if I could, speaker. In past years, some of these budgets we go through get pretty involved and pretty sizable. Will we have like sleeves or so to keep these separate, or sometimes we've been issued like a book where they can all go in? So as we get down to the end of the year and we're working these things, it's a nice reference there.
I believe the committee assistant has accordion folders for you. We just didn't get them out today because we didn't think you'd need them.
I just didn't know if you were trying to go paperless in here. I don't want to attempt it.
I don't think that'll be possible.
Thank you. That's what I was after.
Further questions right now? Okay.
Okay, so what will happen is it's kind of a two-part process. There'll be a budget hearing. So the fiscal analyst will get up, go through the budget analysis just like I did here, only give you very specifics on that budget. The agency will come up behind them and provide testimony on what they want you to hear, whether they like the governor's recommendation, whether they want more money, whether they want some change. And then a day or so later, and we'll provide you with that schedule, you will provide recommendations. So recommendations, and this will get a little bit complicated, which is why I always talk about it, is you always say, okay, what can we recommend? Well, first thing, do you want to add money? Do you want to delete money? Those are pretty easy. The other ones are add language. That's what we call a proviso. If you want to add language underneath a particular fund in the appropriations bill to maybe describe how you want them to expend it or something specific you want them to do, that would be proviso language. The one thing that this committee can do as a budget committee that will not happen in House appropriations or on the floor is you have the ability to just add comments. And we put those comments into the subcommittee report. They are read by the chair during report out. But if you want to commend an agency for lowering their fees, or you want to condone an agency for overspending their fees or something that they did that you didn't like, those are things that you can also do. You can put comments in. They don't go into the bill, they don't go anywhere else but in the subcommittee report as a comment from this committee. Is that confusing?
No questions so far. All right, carry on.
Okay. So once you have made recommendations, we will then put together subcommittee reports. We will have a separate subcommittee report for 2023 and one for 2024 with your recommendations from this committee. What happens then is we have to get your signature. And I'm going to do that in quotes because we used to, pre-COVID, have an actual sheet of paper that with lines on it with your name where we would come around and find you to get your signature. Now, that's what this next sheet of paper is kind of to explain our process now on how we do signatures, since we don't actually do a physical signature anymore. We will email you via blind copy. And the reason we do blind copy is because, as we've talked about before with Coma and Cora, you can't have an email communication amongst yourselves. So if we blind copy, you can't do a reply all. We don't want you to talk amongst yourselves on these recommendations, but we will blind copy you by approximately noon the day before report out, and we will send you the subcommittee reports. Now, this doesn't mean you agree with them. What it means is you agree they've gone through the committee process and can move forward into House appropriations to the full committee. So it's not that you agree with the recommendations, it's they've been through the process. I'll talk here in a minute about minority reports, which is you don't agree with something that was done. So we will email you by noon. You do not have to respond. As a matter of fact, not responding means, yes, I'm okay with everything. I don't need to talk to you about it. If you want to respond and say, I found a typo, or I don't think that's what we did, I think we did something else, then please let me know as soon as possible that there's possibly an issue. But in essence, we provide these to you via email. You don't need to respond. You're, in essence, by getting it, saying, yes, I agree, we'll move it through the process. And we have to get those responses back by 5 o'clock the end of that day. And then we will make the committee reports for House appropriations.
Representative Delperday.
Specific on that, what if I've got something come through that I really don't like and I refuse to sign it? Does that really stop anything, or does it just move on anyway?
Well, again, not signing it and disagreeing with something are two entirely different things. So this signature is, you went through the process, whether you agreed with it or not. Did we go through the process and can it move forward? If you absolutely don't like one of the recommendations or any of the recommendations, you can do what we call a minority report. And a minority report doesn't mean you're in the minority party. It just means you don't agree with something and you want to state your disagreement. You will work with me on writing up whatever you want. You can write it up or you can ask me to write it up. I will put it on a separate sheet of paper. It doesn't go into the subcommittee report, but it gets attached to the back. And I will have a little line for you to sign it. And it gets attached to the subcommittee report. And then when your chair presents the subcommittee report in full committee, he will state there is a minority report. He doesn't have to read it. He has to acknowledge it's there. If you want to show up to the full committee, now it's up to the chair whether you can testify or not, the chair of House Appropriations. But sometimes they will let you read it if you want to. But that if you have a disagreement, then you can do a minority report and we can attach it to the back. And you can say, this is what I don't agree with.
Any further questions? All right.
Okay. When we are in committee and you're working on making your recommendations, if you have some kind of amendment, whether you want to add money, delete money, or put some kind of proviso together, if you could work with myself or the reviser on getting that drawn up so that we, number one, we know what it is you're trying to do and we get it, all the language correct, so that we can have that ready for when you make your recommendations, and that way it can be explained to the committee. Any other questions on that process? A couple other things I just want to touch on. You've got a really colorful little bubble diagram here. For those of you who may not have been on a budget committee before, just want to kind of walk you through the process. So the process are the bubble diagrams, and the other document, the green sheet, shows you all the different documents we create throughout the process. So let's say you specifically wanted to add $100,000 for XYZ, and you want to watch that amendment go through the process, and you want to make sure it stays in. Because we'll go through a process where it might at some point be taken out. So I just want to explain that, because we'll have a lot of people will follow the budget through the process. So again, in September, we start out with the agency's budget submission. Then we get the governor's recommendation. And then in February, we'll do February and the first couple weeks of March. We will do the hearings and report outs. Then you go to the committee as a whole. After House Appropriations has made all of their recommendations, we create a new bill. We'll take the governor's recommendation bill and we'll rewrite it with whatever the final recommendations are from House Appropriations. Then it goes to the floor for floor action. Then we rewrite the bill again. And again, this happens both on the House and the Senate side. So then if you got a House bill that maybe you added $100,000 and on the Senate side they added $50,000, then that has to go to conference. And so we go to conference, and the chair, vice chair, and ranking of House Appropriations sits down at a table with the chair, vice chair, and ranking of Senate Ways and Means, and they decide, is it 100,000, is it 50,000, or is it some other amount? And so then we keep track of all of that. Hopefully after that, we have a final bill. It goes across the floor. At that point, they can't make any changes to the bill. It's a yes or no, up or down vote. And that bill gets passed. Sometimes there have been times where we don't pass a bill before the break, and it follows through to the end, and we add omnibus to it. The last couple of years, we've had a mega bill, and then during the break, we will put together what we call an omnibus memo, which we will go through and look at all the policy bills that you have passed, that you are maybe in conference with, whether the governor signed it, and we will talk about what the fiscal note is for all of those bills. And then we will sit down with House Appropriations and Senate Ways and Means. We will go through the omnibus memo and say, you passed House Bill 3215 and the agency says they need $1 million in order to do this. Do you want to give them $1 million? So we go through all of that. Also, the other thing, and I do back up just a little bit, because omnibus happens after the spring consensus revenue estimates, a lot of times when you're making recommendations, one of the recommendations you can make is, I really want to add $1 million to this budget, but I want to make sure we have enough money at the end. You can either add $1 million and review it at omnibus, which means I put the money in, but then at omnibus we say, do you want to leave it in or not? Or you can say, I want to review at omnibus, maybe adding $1 million. So we don't put it in, but then at omnibus, I say, you thought about adding $1 million. Here's your new consensus revenue. Do you have enough money? Do you want to add it or not? So one of the recommendations you can make is to review something in omnibus. And so those will get added to the omnibus memo as well. So throughout that process, we create a lot of documents. So I've provided this green sheet for you to show you kind of what some of the documents are. It starts out with the budget analysis, then it goes to the subcommittee reports. The subcommittee reports are all separate in the beginning. You'll have a separate 2023, a separate 2024, separate House, separate Senate. But then once we've reported out, we combine the House and Senate together, because in House Appropriations and Senate Ways and Means, if one of the agencies has reported out in one chamber, the other chamber always knows what they do. Because most often you go, we want to do something different. So it goes to conference. So we'll combine those together. There's a conference comparison sheet that we put together. Now, if the House and Senate did the exact same thing, doesn't go to conference, it's done. It's going to happen because there wasn't any debate over it. When we start putting bills together, we will put bill packets together. They will include a profile. The shorthands, a shorthand is a list of every change to the governor's recommendation that's been made. That's a shorthand. A 3-column is when we get to the end, it'll say, here's what the House recommendations were, here's what the Senate recommendations were, here's what we did in conference, and those are the final actions. And then the bill explainer goes through every section in the bill and says what the agency is and what the changes were from the governor's recommendation. And then last but not least, the omnibus memo that we put together. So there's a lot of different parts and pieces, a lot of documents that we put together for you to explain everything that we do that has to do with an appropriations bill. Did I get done in 15 minutes?
Any questions for Shirley? Representative Delperdane.
Can't let you get off that easy. When we make changes or recommendations, amendments, whatever you want to call it, how much of those actually get through when the chair presents it to the approach? Does approach generally let them go through, or do they just rip them off and move forward?
We don't track a percentage. I would probably say 95% go through. But there will be some that they will either strike out or they may change something.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Shirley.
That's all I've got for you. Any other questions about any of the process or what we're going to start in on with budget hearings? Okay. Very
good. Well, we wanted to do a little informational there, kind of a recap. But that's all for today. We're going to have informational hearings on indigent defense tomorrow and community corrections. But any comments? All right, we're adjourned.